How would you live if every moment was eternal? Not that you'll live infinitely long, that you'll never die. Your life will still be finite. There'll still be some point in the future you will die and it will end. But every moment within it is eternal. Every moment in the universe is eternal. Every moment of everyone else's life is also eternal. How would you live if this were true? This is the third of a series of 3 videos that I'm making on an article that I wrote called Nietzsche's Eternalist Return. And I call it Nietzsche's Eternalist Return because of the philosophy of eternalism, which says precisely this, that every moment is eternal. Now, it differs from Nietzsche's conception of the eternal return because for Nietzsche, the universe will repeat an infinite number of times exactly as it was. And so Nietzsche evokes this to challenge us. How do we live in light of this? For Nietzsche, again, it's not that we don't die. It's not that our life is infinitely long. We have to deal with this particular finite life, but it will recur an infinite number of times. And so it's similar to this idea. But as I pointed out in my second video, Nietzsche's conception of the eternal return, of the eternal recurrence of the universe, doesn't make sense in terms of modern physics. At the same time, what modern physics gives us, specifically what the theory of relativity gives us, is a better way to understand Nietzsche's idea, to get at the core insight of Nietzsche's idea, which is that everything is already eternal. Everything that exists, no matter where it exists in space or time, exists. Just because something is in the past relative to me, or relative to where I'm experiencing myself as now, just because it's in the past does not mean that it does not exist. It has not passed out of all existence. And just because something is in the future relative to what I'm experiencing now or what I'm experiencing as now doesn't mean that it does not exist. So that is contrasted with presentism, the philosophy of presentism, which is more maybe our go-to common sense view of time, which is that all that exists in the present, and that an event from the past no longer exists. An event in the future does not yet exist. All that exists in the present. That's presentism. And eternalism says that everything that exists in all of space and time simply exists. Now, that doesn't mean that everything exists simultaneously, obviously, because there is different positions in time, just as there's different positions in space. But it does mean that when we're talking about other times in relation to where we find ourselves now, we can't negate the existence of those. That's the kind of eternalism that's the kind of eternal that eternalism puts forward, that eternalism proposes. That everything is eternal in this sense. Not in the sense of infinite temporal duration, but in the sense of existing regardless of its position in time. And as I pointed out in the second video, it can be hard to get one's head around this, and language kind of avoids it as well, because language because language evolved within a specific framework, which is more useful to us, which again is perhaps that presentist framework. But for more information on that, and for more information on what the theory of relativity says about that, and modern physics say about that, you can look at my second video. I also include some sort of helpful videos I found on YouTube to kind of help grasp that concept. In this video, I'm not going to talk about the physics, and I'm not going to really talk about the philosophy either. What I'm going to talk about is, what do we do if this is true? And you don't have to assume that it's true. You can take it as a thought experiment, like Nietzsche proposed for his own idea of eternal return. Publicly, he tended to put it forward as a thought experiment, as something to challenge you and shock you and say, and make you sort of feel, how am I living my life? And how should I live my life? If this is the only life that we have, how should I best live it? And I think that this has a similar use. It can be useful in that way. At the same time, I think that it gets more force from the fact that it's very plausible in terms of science, and that it could really be true. And so I tend to think that it is true, although not with 100% certainty, but I do tend to think that it is true. And so if it's either plausible or if you find that it's helpful, that this video may be good for you. So what I've done in the other videos is I've gone through my article, which I'll include a link to in the description, and kind of read it out and also expanded on different parts of it, just talking out loud basically on different parts of it, because it's quite compressed. And there's a draft that exists that is much longer. For this particular video, I'm going to actually mostly just read the draft and maybe jump in now and again if I want to make an idea clearer or expand on it a little bit. Because this section is not very long at all. So it's really just this, and then that's the end. And so I think it's much more effective to read what I originally wrote as the draft, and that should cover everything that I've written here. But if you don't want to listen through that, I don't know how long it will take, feel free to just jump to that article and have a read. A couple of words about what I've got on the screen maybe as well. Obviously on the right we have the philosopher himself, Friedrich Nietzsche, who came up with this idea of the eternal return, which I've now adapted into the Eternalist return. There's his idea returning now in an eternalist guise, even more relevant than before. And he is contemplating here on the left the painting Albion Rose by William Blake. There's a lot of affinities between Nietzsche and Blake, often quite extraordinary ones. And this figure, you could say, is maybe one interpretation, Nietzsche's Übermensch. Now, Blake was writing before Nietzsche, so there's no direct influence that way. And there's no evidence that Nietzsche was aware of Blake or derived anything from Blake. So, but you could see that this luminous figure is, open, joyous, affirmative, glorious. And this is what Nietzsche aspired for humanity to be or to become. And involved in that is the affirmation of finitude, the affirmation of life as eternal. And eternity for Blake is much more, at least Ian McGilchrist, probably among others, but certainly Ian McGilchrist has argued that for Blake, eternity is very much about qualitative depth rather than extension. So again, it's not about an everlasting life, but it's a life of maximum intensity, something like that. Maximum energy, maximum intensity, maximum meaning. And so this is what we see depicted here in this glorious figure. And so I'm just going to leave it on the screen because I don't have any other slides prepared for this. I just have the draft that I'm going to read and go through the different ways that this idea of the eternal return or the eternalist return relates to life as we live it, the different ways that it would affect life as we live it, in reference to the past, in reference to the present, in reference to the future, and also taking into consideration its dark side, because it does have a dark side, and the tragedy of life as well. So, if the eternalist vision of reality is true, what does it mean for us practically? Firstly, it forces us to confront the life we are living as a whole, rather than as something that is continually falling away into non-being. So that would be the presentist or common sense way of thinking about life. If we consider that we live the whole of our life eternally, we may come to clearly feel our attitude toward that life. Does that awareness elicit horror and disgust, or exaltation, and why? Have we been petty, reactive, resentful, consuming our time brooding on perceived wrongs or staving off potential threats? Or have we been noble, active, generous, and free? The eternalist return is diagnostic. So it helps us to see our lives clearly because we're forced to see them as a whole. And in general, in this kind of everyday common sense presentist way of thinking, we're not thinking about them as a whole, or at least not consistently thinking about them as a whole. We're thinking, okay, that thing happened, that was unfortunate, but that's gone for good. So for many people, the thought will generate a degree of horror. There are few who have never done something they deeply regretted or endured something they wish never to live through again. But many of us will also have experienced times when our suffering or sin has instructed, deepened, or improved us in some important way. Perhaps a period of suffering hardened us in our weakness, or softened us to the suffering of others. It could go either way. Perhaps a terrible sin revealed an aspect of ourselves we didn't want to see, which we then integrated for good or overcame. Perhaps a grievous mistake led, through a chain of cause and effect, to an event that enriched our life with its goodness. Perhaps it was our very attitude toward the misfortune that decided the way our lives and those around us then went, whether we responded with resentment and self-loathing or with affirmation, striving, and love. There are many ways that good may come to flow out of evil. How do those unfortunate events sit within our lives now? Are they not, in a real sense, fortunate? That is to say, if we've done the above and we've responded in a positive way to them, are they not, in a sense, fortunate? And so the others may be too. It is a matter of how we incorporate the past into our present and future, and through incorporating it, we interpret it. The events of a life are what they are only in the context of that life. In this sense, the past is shaped by its future. Our actions and attitudes now determine the past to some extent. Now, this is not the same as self-deception. We must first look at our life clearly as it stands before us in this moment before we can incorporate those things we don't initially like. And this incorporation is effortful, almost physical, not a mere wish of the mind. It means a real change in the course of our life. So, in this part, we've talked about incorporation and interpretation. When we incorporate a negative event into our life, we derive some good from it. And in doing so, we interpret it, because what it isn't just, there's no bare facts. That's something else that Nietzsche said. There's no bare facts that we can sort of just access without meaning or interpretation. And so what that does is it changes its nature in a way. And if it changes its nature enough, if we derive enough good from it, it simply becomes, well, maybe simply is too strong a word, but it becomes in large part fortunate rather than unfortunate. So that's incorporation. and interpretation. And it's not self-deception, because we have to first look at our lives honestly to see first of all how we stand in relation to our life. Do we resent it? Do we want to escape it? To also see how our life actually looks to us when we actually look at it, instead of looking away from it or just neglecting it. And then we can take an active approach. Then we can work with it. Then we can build with it. We can incorporate and interpret it. And obviously there's limits to that. We can't just interpret everything in any way. We can't just interpret absolutely every event into something absolutely good or something like that. There's intrinsic limits that we're working within, but there is that possibility for transformation. Now, at the same time, there may be events in our lives that could genuinely be considered exceptions, not in an absolute sense because they remain part of it, so they're not genuine and full-blown exceptions, but in a significant sense nonetheless. How do we know that they are exceptions? Here too we must guard against self-deception. We know by the way we genuinely feel about them in the present, and by the very different way our lives have gone before and after. We make a past misdeed an exception by not repeating it and by letting it go. In a similar way, we rob a wrong done against us of its power. Eventually, these events become insignificant, almost forgotten, things we could readily will eternally precisely because they play such a minuscule role in defining us. So we're still willing them eternally, assuming that they come to mind at all. We're still willing every detail of our lives, but their meaning has changed, their significance has changed, and not just in this abstract cognitive way, but in the way that our lives are shaped around them or exist around them. They are exceptions because of that. As the philosopher Alexander Nahamis notes in his book on Nietzsche, which is Nietzsche, Life as Literature, whether one incorporates these events or lets them go as exceptions, one has no reason for resentment. So we could say that what this means is, if we were wronged in the past, if this is one of these events that has happened in our lives that grates on us, we can forgive. We can render it an exception. If we wronged someone else or did some wrong in the past, something that we consider wrong and that we're ashamed of, then we can let that go and not repeat it, like change our character such that it does not happen again. And thereby we can render it an exception. In his genealogy of morals, Nietzsche praised those who by nature could readily incorporate and forget. Quote, "To be incapable of taking one's enemies, one's accidents, even one's misdeeds seriously for very long, that is the sign of strong, full natures in whom there is an excess of the power to form, to mold, to recuperate, and to forget." End quote. And I got that quote from Nahamis's book, although originally obviously it's from Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morals. So in relation to negative past events, we can say, there's the ones that really bother us, the ones that would seem to prevent us from affirming the whole of life, ones which we uncover when we take life as a whole, perhaps due to the impulse of the eternalist return or the eternal return. We look at life as a whole and we say, okay, these are things that I can't affirm and are part of my life. Well, we see that we can incorporate them in the ways that we've talked about. We can change their meaning by what we do with them or by what we find as flowing from them in terms of things that are good, things that we can affirm. And we can also render them exceptions, depending on what they are. We can go either of those ways. Some things we incorporate so that they become good and fortunate, and some things we render exceptions. They're bad, but they don't define us. They're genuinely exceptions. Remembering that to make them exceptions isn't just to declare them exceptions. It's not just to change the cognitive way that we sort of think about them. It's actually something much more concrete and effortful than that, much more significant than that, and is actually to do with how our lives are lived as a whole. So much for the negative events. But what about the good events? It may be that you find the overall pattern of your life worth affirming in spite of or even because of the bad parts. It may be that a specific period or even a moment within it makes all the rest worth it. So it could be either of those. It could be that we just look at it as a whole and we see that overall the whole of my life is good for various different reasons, due to various different events and circumstances that have occurred in it. Or we could actually focus on a particular moment. There could be a particular moment, a particular period of our lives. The rest could be relatively bad or at least relatively dull. But we could say that for the sake of this moment or this period, I affirm my entire life. I want my life to return. Well, return in Nietzsche's conception, or I just affirm the fact that it is eternal, that every moment of it is eternal. For the sake of these moments, I affirm all the rest. So we can see it in either way. But in our everyday presentist mode of thought, we mourn that everything good ends. So all the good moments of our lives pass away forever and in every respect. All the joyful, loving, powerful moments in which we feel most alive quickly pass away. But for the Eternalist, nothing truly passes away. We live these moments eternally. This may come as a great relief. There is no need to protectively cling to experience, and no need to desperately seek its replacement or return. The passing moment is already eternal, and you open yourself to its richness more fully when you let it flow. So our attitude towards life can be less anxious and less clinging and desperate, right? If we do experience good moments, if we do experience good in our lives, we can just let them go. We don't need to cling to them. And if they pass away, we don't need to desperately seek their replacement. They haven't passed out of all existence. They exist in their own times, in their own places. And so, like I said, I'll just reread that last bit. The passing moment is already eternal, and you open yourself to its richness most fully when you let it flow. The poet, William Blake, whose painting, of course, is on the screen, the poet William Blake's brief meditation on eternity captures this perfectly. And so, this is the poem by Blake. He who binds to himself a joy does the winged life destroy, but he who kisses the joy as it flies lives in eternity's sunrise. And that brings us to the present. How shall we use this moment? What shall we do with it? Whatever we do eternally. What is there to notice within it? What is there to relish? We relish it eternally. The Eternalist return pulls us away from the idea that the present is only something to pass through in quest of something better, greater, more complete. But the present is never merely the means, also always an end. Whatever else we may be pursuing, each moment presents itself as for the sake of this. It has that intrinsic value. Now, of course, at the same time, we also are passing through it. We're also in quest of something greater, more complete. Both of these aspects are part of life, but the aspect in which we're seeking something more, seeking something beyond it, can easily overwhelm the aspect of life which is just appreciating and living in each moment. And each moment is, of course, eternal. But for all that, the present is also a pivot from which we can alter our life. Not only the future, but also, as we've seen, the past. We shouldn't be distracted from this by the fact that our whole life, including our future, exists. This whole life is our life. We live it. And our now is when we live this part of it. We can and do shape it. And in this moment, we can take active responsibility for it. In the previous video, I talked about the objection against eternalism that states that there is no free will in eternalism because everything that we do in our lives, in a certain sense, we've done. It's determined. And I responded to that by saying that eternalism doesn't decide on free will. It doesn't say whether free will or causal determinism is true or not. And if we do something freely, and if free will is true, if free will does hold of reality, then that's all that we need. That's all that we need. It doesn't. If in the future I do a particular thing, and I do it freely, then I simply do it freely. It's not that I cannot do otherwise. It's that I simply do not do otherwise. I do not choose to do otherwise. Just like if I did something freely in the past, and I freely chose it, then that action was indeed free. The fact that it exists in the past and has a determinate character doesn't mean that it was unfree, that it was that I was constrained, or that it was fated, or something like that. Now, assuming free will at all, the dismal life of someone paralyzed by the notion that, in one particular sense, their future life was already lived, would be as much a result of their freely chosen actions as the rich and joyous life of someone who responded actively to the same realization. So if we realize this, and we understand that our future exists just as our past exists, we can actually choose the way that we respond to that in that moment. So if we respond to it negatively and we become kind of possessed by that, or possessed in a negative way by that, we become paralyzed by that, because in a certain sense we've already done every action that we will later do. What we're actually doing is we're just freely determining our life to be bad, freely determining our life to be miserable and characterized by the psychological experience of constraint. But if we react to it differently, if we use it as a prompt, if we use it as something to jolt us into taking ownership of our actions and making the best life possible and making the best decisions we can make, then we get a better life. Now, whichever path we follow, of course, is the one that we actually follow in the one reality, the one space-time that exists. But from our perspective in this moment, it really matters what we choose. And so we live life in every moment. We live life in this moment, and so we can live it better and we can live it worse. So in this very moment, we influence the life we live eternally. This may be through the very next act that we do. So going back to that quote in the first video in this series, the quote from The Gay Science, which is maybe the most famous quote about the eternal return by Nietzsche. The quote, "The question in each and every thing, do you desire this once more and innumerable times more?" End quote. So that's what you ask yourself, or what the person confronted with this thought experiment or the idea of the eternal return asks himself. Do you desire this once more and innumerable times more? So we might apply that to the very next moment. Would I desire this once more and innumerable times more? Or put in a eternalist framing, would I desire this act to be eternal, to never pass away? Perhaps we do something a bit more courageous than cowardly, a bit more active than slothful, a bit more generous than resentful. Perhaps we do something to concretely benefit another. Although so far we've focused on our own lives, and this is Nietzsche's focus too in general, eternalism brings with it the awareness that the lives of everyone else are just as eternal as mine. One good moment you give another is eternal to them too. An eternalist return informs ethics, not just an aesthetics of self-cultivation. So that's something else that I think is really important to point out. It's not just about oneself. It automatically engages you with others, because their lives are also eternal. To the extent that you experience their lives as being real and really lived, you have to contend with the quality of them. You have to contend with what you are doing to them and what you're contributing to them. And so it has a real ethical implication as well. On a deeper level, we influence our eternal life not just by what we do, but by the type of person we are or come to be. There is something lacking in the vision of someone who continually asks themselves, do you desire this once more and innumerable times more? So that's the quote we just read. That's the quote that is contained in that thought experiment where the demon comes to the person and says, you'll live your life over and over again. And so that person's imagined to say to himself, do you desire this once more and innumerable times more, to kind of determine the kind of life that he'd like to live in innumerable times. And that's good to start with. That's good as a first step. So you think about this idea of eternalism and then you say to yourself, well, what do I desire? What do I desire to be eternal? What action would I desire that is eternal in the next moment? But you don't want to stay there. You don't want to stay on that level of having to continually ask yourself, in terms of every action you do I desire this to be eternal? It would be a little bit like turning this into a categorical imperative, like Kant puts forward. You would sort of use this as the criterion for every action, and you would be this sort of cognitive agent that goes around the world goes around life thinking through every action through this lens. For one, it would quickly become tedious or distracting, but it also implies that the person doesn't know what is best, or that they must wrestle with themselves to achieve it. So it implies a lack in that respect. It's the difference between someone who has to continually ask themselves which action will most accord with virtue, and someone who is genuinely virtuous, who just acts and doesn't need to act. And obviously, to acquire virtue, you need to do that. You need to think. You need to ask yourself. You need to go through that cognitive process. But if you have virtue, you don't need to do that, at least not in the same way or to the same degree. Let's say the prospect of an eternalist return weighs on us. We cannot bring ourselves to affirm this life exactly as it is eternally. Yet, rather than crush us completely, this awareness spurs a strong desire to change, so that one day we may be such that we can affirm it gladly. What then? Our old habits and vices are deeply embedded within us, woven into our very flesh, in the structure of neurons that make up our brains. This is not a matter of a momentary act of the mind, nor a series of better actions we force ourselves to do. The required transformation is radical. Our fundamental attitudes need to change. Our body needs to change. So again, it just won't do to be exactly the same type of person you were when you first thought about this and when you first asked yourself this. It won't do to just force yourself to do the kind of actions that you know you should do if every moment is eternal. You need to transform and you need to change. You need to become the kind of person that just does those things naturally. Nietzsche has Zarathustra declare, and so this quote is from Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Part 1, Chapter 4, on the despisers of the body, and this is the Hollingdale translation. So Zarathustra declares, I am body entirely, and nothing beside, and soul is only a word for something in the body. End quote. The conscious mind is grounded in the physical unconscious, which is vaster and more powerful than it. And whether building character or building muscle, one works in a similar way, through stubborn repetition. Eventually, all our courageous and generous acts bear fruit as real courage and generosity, become natural, become ourselves. And perhaps then we look at life and find ourselves saying, yes, I affirm it eternally. And I think we really would find ourselves saying that. Again, it's not something that's cognitive and that we're forcing ourselves to do. It's not a sort of propositional belief, but it's something that we would find ourselves saying with our very being. Because of who I am and from who I am, I affirm this life eternally. Precisely what this life will look like will vary with the individual. A world transformed by the eternalist return wouldn't necessarily be filled with stereotypical Nietzschean Übermenschen. Nietzsche acknowledges this in a note shortly after the idea of the eternal return came to him. So this is from his notebooks in the year 1881. He says, quote, "Whoever finds the highest feeling in striving, let him strive. Whoever finds it in rest, let him rest. Whoever finds it in subordination, following, and obedience, let him obey. Only let him become conscious of what gives him the highest feeling and spare no means. Eternity is at stake." End quote. But it may be that one never overcomes oneself, despite one's best efforts. It may be that one's bad character is too ingrained. Indeed, one may have been born with it. The time left is too short, or what one has done or suffered is just too grievous to be redeemed. And, regardless of one's existential affirmation or resentment, bad things happen, sometimes unimaginably terrible things. Finally, for all of us, life ends, often unexpectedly, long before we wish it to. Rarely, if ever, have we done all that we'd want to. Those who live bad lives, regardless of their level of complicity, live them eternally. And good lives are eternally curtailed. And so this isn't just to say that the people that live bad lives, that live miserable lives, deserve that at all, because you could suffer innocently from that. You could suffer because of the way you were born, or you could meet with just a terrible, terrible tragedy that you cannot either integrate in a positive way or render an exception. It's totally possible that could happen. And so there are these just tragic conditions of existence. This is a dark aspect of the eternalist vision, that all of this is eternal too, and that these lives are also eternal. But the vision may be of reality itself. Can you consistently think away all evil from reality, retaining only the good? Are you not left with mere words or a bare abstraction? The physical laws that allow these bodies, and therefore these minds, the freedom to grow and move and be, necessarily allows for their torment and destruction. There is no being without tragedy, and on the personal level, the ever-present threat of tragedy fuels our sense of the preciousness of what we have. So it's very useful in that sense. Now, it might be objected that eternalism overrides this, because, again, everything is eternal. So where is the preciousness if everything is eternal and nothing truly passes away? But an eternalist life is still finite. Though each moment of my life is eternal, there are still an infinite number of moments I will never have. Right? Because I'm born and eventually I die, and the time span between that is composed of the moments that are my life. But there's an infinite amount of moments outside that I could live, that I don't live. And so in that respect, life is eternal. And the preciousness that tragedy, particularly the tragedy of untimely death, or even timely death in a sense, because it still limits us, the tragedy that poses isn't erased by eternalism. And so we still have the sense of preciousness. These moments are eternal, but the moments that we don't live are not eternal. Well, they're not eternal because we don't have them, right? They're not eternally lived by us. Finally, tragedy itself isn't only terrible. Paradoxically, it can also be beautiful. Thus, tragedies are some of the highest, finest, and most moving examples of human art. And we can cultivate the sense for tragedy in regard to our life and all life as well. And so that's important to consider as well. And that's a helpful way to look at the world to the extent that we're able, which often isn't very far, but still is perhaps not, it's not completely negligible. I think it is helpful to see things this way to the extent that we can. But even when the tragedy is too great, or we cannot attain the distance to appreciate it, we can still choose our attitude toward it, how we will bear it. So even when the tragedy, which is often or maybe even typically the case, even when the tragedy is too much for us to take an aesthetic, distanced view of it, and gain some sense of appreciation for it, we can still choose our attitude toward it. We can still choose how we bear it. This is what the Holocaust survivor and psychotherapist Viktor Frankl described as a final way to meaning when all other ways are beyond one's grasp. So this is a quote from his very famous book, Man's Search for Meaning. He says, quote, "Everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances," end quote. The way we face the tragic conditions of existence carries a dignity all its own. The nobility of the human being at his best consists, in part, in how he beholds and bears tragedy. And even if an unfortunate life finally defeats us, all that we have lived before that is eternal. So that's something to consider as well. Even if a terrible event happens and essentially destroys us psychologically, if not physically, if we've lived a good life until that point, that all that is good in that life remains, in a sense. Now I'm using remains in a metaphorical sense, right? But is eternal in the sense that eternalism posits. It exists in space and time. And so that loss is not absolute, and that tragedy is not absolute in regard to ourselves. But of course that doesn't solve the issue for people who never live a good life, who have a life characterized by overwhelming misery through most of it. That doesn't resolve the issue for them. And so there is irreducible tragedy, there is irreducible negativity in this picture of the universe. Nietzsche spent the last decade of his life insane, utterly unable to care for himself. For him, this would have been a fate far worse than physical suffering or an untimely death. In fact, he had a lot of physical suffering in his life, so he was used to it. And it was cruelly ironic. One of history's most brilliant minds reduced to utter imbecility. Based on hints within his work, it seems he would have ended his life had he clearly seen this coming. So, for instance, this is just one example in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. There is a section where he talks about ending one's life at the right time. At the same time, he knew it was a definite possibility. His own father died of a brain disease, and Nietzsche suffered from similar symptoms most of his life. So he had these terrible migraines, for instance, and his vision deteriorated. Perhaps at his very strongest and noblest, though, Nietzsche would have affirmed his life, would have willed its eternal return, even with this, even knowing this. We don't know. It seems possible that he could have considered it. It seems possible that he would have thought that thought to himself, what if I was to go mad and never recover? It seems plausible that he would have put that to himself. And we don't know exactly what he answered. It would be entirely reasonable if he answered to himself, no, I cannot affirm that. That would be entirely reasonable as a human being. Perhaps in a certain moment, he found himself strong enough, noble enough, luminous enough to say yes. It seems that maybe one can break through to certain mystic states of consciousness where these things, where this absolute affirmation can happen in regard to things that we could not otherwise affirm. But in ordinary human consciousness, perhaps this level of affirmation isn't possible. And that again, that is as it is. This is a vision of reality, and reality is not necessarily just the best possible reality that we happen to be able to posit or propositionally put forward at any given time. Reality is reality. So that is my video. That is my video on how to live like every moment is eternal. To live in relation to our past, in relation to our present, in relation to our future, and in relation to tragedy. Just as Nietzsche intended, this way of looking at existence forces us to attend to our actual life, attend to the actual world we find ourselves in, attend to the actual lives that we find ourselves with. And so it fills this world, it fills this life with meaning, or rather it helps us to see the meaning that is already inherent there and avoid the temptation to look beyond the world to some transcendent realm or some future paradise that would justify it. But here and now is eternity, and in each moment is eternity, and in the beings that actually exist and actually form part of the structure of space-time, form part of the very structure of reality, there is beauty and depth and goodness and meaning. And it challenges us to do something with that. It also avoids another kind of nihilism, a kind of nihilism that says this present sliver that is the present moment, the sliver of time that I inhabit and is constantly passing away, is all there is. And therefore all is vanity, all is empty. It rejects this kind of thinking as well, because everything is full, and the world is full, reality is full to overflowing almost. And so it's not a passive thing, it's not a matter of thinking, it's not a matter of merely reflecting, but of taking responsibility, because I am a being in this world as well, and I am becoming in this world as well, and I can direct that becoming, and I can be a different kind of being. And so it's a transformative way of seeing the world. It transforms the world that we see, and it transforms us in the world, or at least it can do if we take that up and take that upon ourselves. And that is how to live like every moment is eternal.